Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week I'm going to service this lovely Giant Defy. If you're new to the channel, I'm a professional bike mechanic. I service these bikes and we put them out on YouTube so you can see how we deal with a service on a day-to-day basis. And with this bike there are all manner of problems. This is a freshly purchased winter bike on the used market. You can hear here it has issues. We've got a very noisy brake. We have a very tight bottom bracket and we have some cabling issues to sort out on this bike. We have a front derailleur that isn't working at all. So you can see here we've got no movement. You can hear the shifter clicking there. There's a marginal movement in that front derailleur, but it's not changing or dropping gears. So that has its own issue that we need to sort out. And you can see here it's got a worn chain. This is a KMC chain, so this wouldn't have originally been on this bike. So that would suggest that maybe it's already used one chain, or they've upgraded to this KMC chain and it's only used this chain. Don't think this bike has done many miles, but the chain wear and also the fact that's a non-original chain would suggest to me that it has done a few miles, but just not many. So my first stage with any service that I'm doing is to take the bike apart and decide what I'm going to clean, what I'm going to lubricate and what needs attention. First problem I had here, a very tight cassette. No cassette should be that tight. The bolt on that is not a moving part, so I needed to use a breaker bar here. That's simply where someone has just over tightened that when they put that cassette on. So we need to torque that up when we put it back on and make sure it's the correct tightness. You can see here it's not too bad. It's dirty. You can certainly see the favourite gears in the centre there down towards the smaller ones. So we'll clean that up and that one will actually go back on the bike. Now when I undid this rear derailleur cable, you can see where it goes in the frame, a little bit of a kink in the shaping, and also it had a few frayed out ends on the derailleur cable itself. But look at this, the actual derailleur hanger on the frame was completely loose. It is held in to a degree by the wheel, but if those nuts come undone and fall out, you could have all manner of problems with this. So we'll need to make sure that's correct when we put the derailleur back on. You can see here also a bit of build up of debris on the jockey wheels. We need to clean that off and lubricate that one as well. Now when I undid this cable, you see there that the derailleur dropped as if it was going to the smaller ring. So that immediately tells me the derailleur itself is okay and that its shifting issue is going to be cable related. So I need to work that out as well. You can see there how dirty and grimy it is on the back. So we'll clean that up and we'll also lubricate that. Now this is a very common problem on Shimano. You can see here how that chain set is not really spinning very freely, and that is simply because there is too much preload and pre-tension being put on the bearing. It's tightened up too tightly. So when we undo these bolts, we have a pre-tensioner in the center of this pedal arm, and it's that determines the tension on the bearing. This here should be finger tight, and you can see there I can't even undo it. I actually had to use pliers to actually loosen that off, and I'll slacken that off slightly, pull that arm just slightly and look at the difference just because it was over tensioned. Imagine riding that with that treacly feel, with your energy being sapped away simply because that bolt there has been over tightened. So when we put that back together, we'll also pre-tension it correctly. Out comes the chain set, and you can see there it's not too bad on the back of it, but we're going to show you a problem with this on the bench that really sums up why you should get your bike regularly serviced. Next up, I'm going to look at the brakes. So initially I'm going to take out the brake pads. Out comes the pivot pin there, then out come the brake pads themselves. I can check those on the bench, look at the wear on them, determine what I need to do with those and clean them up and lubricate as necessary. Same with the fronts, so that little pivot pin there, and then out come the pads themselves. That's now ready for the bench work. So this is the first problem I had with the chain set. These were too tight to undo. I couldn't physically do them on the bench. They do have a torque setting, and you can see here I'm having to put all my effort into breaking those off. The reason for this is twofold. They're over tightened, but what's happened here is it's corrosion that's caused this to become very hard to undo. In the cycling world, we have a lot of stainless steel and aluminium parts that are put together and coupled together, and this causes a thing called galvanic corrosion. It is notorious for causing things like this to corrode. You always think of aluminium and stainless steel as something that doesn't corrode, but this here, this sort of white layering, this white powdering, is stainless steel corrosion, and so it tightens up the threads and it causes this white powdery effect on aluminium. This is where it's been touching the aluminium chain rings, and that's what's caused the corrosion. So I'll clean that up, but more importantly, I'll lubricate it to try and avoid it happening between this service and the next service. Same with every component on the bike. I will take either the component apart or lubricate it, and that's what I'm doing here with the rear derailleur, and then a few parts I'm going to put into our ultrasonic cleaner. Now these are anodized parts. You can see the greyness on there, that's been anodized onto the aluminium. Very important with any ultrasonic cleaner not to use any heat on anodized parts because it can spoil the anodizing. So we've put these through the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I can wash them down, clean off that degreaser that I've got onto the part. You can see how nicely that front derailleur has begun to come up just through going through the ultrasonic cleaner. Dry them off, use an airline, microfiber towels, and just generally clean them up. You know, the ultrasonic cleaner doesn't do all the work, but it certainly helps and certainly starts to lift off that dirt and debris, ready for this phase where I'm really cleaning them down in depth. Don't show everything on camera. You know, some of these things will spend a good amount of time after we've done this to really clean them up, but in this instance most of it came up all right. I was just cleaning off there. There's a sticker that they put on these to fit them on the frames to give you a space in between this and the chain rings. That had residue of that sticker on there, so I cleaned that off first, and then we had some rust here on the back plate, so I'm just using a wire brush there to clean that off, and some wire wool to just lift off that corrosion that was on there to make sure that it's nice when it goes back on the bike. And you can see there that component almost looks like new. Next up, I'm going to deal with the corrosion that was on these chainring bolts, so I'm just putting those in the vise there and just brushing those off with a brass brush to clean off that powderiness. And then what I'll do with these is lubricate them before I put them back together. So do all of those, and then I'm using our anti-seize grease here. I dispense the greases and oils that I use in these syringes. It's just a nice, easy, clean way of me dispensing the lubricants that I use on these various bikes and keeping everything tidy on my bench. And these are actually our own product. We do sell these on our website. We have a store on our website where you can buy these, so if you're interested in putting those onto your bench, do check out our website. The link's always in the description below. I've also lubricated the splines of this chain set arm itself. I want that to all be nice and lubricated because we are in a very salty aired area here, and I know that this is going to be used for a winter bike for this rider, so we need to make sure there's plenty of lubricant on this bike to avoid it corroding going through the winter. Jockey wheels, I'm lubricating here with a premium grease. This is a nice grease that really lubricates these bushes inside these derailleur wheels. And then I will also just use a little bit of thread locker here because these have a pivot that is actually a bolt and a pivot through the center of these. We don't want this coming undone on the bike, so we Loctited those, and then we can do those up, and you can see here that this derailleur is coming back together very, very nicely, and with those jockey wheels all lubricated and ready to go. One thing that's often missed, and only today I actually had one of these where I had to use pliers to undo it to lubricate it before I could adjust it, is thumb adjusters. These often corrode into these derailleurs, so I'm using a little bit of general purpose grease around the top where the thumb adjuster goes, and then I'm using our anti-seize grease in the threaded area, and that will then spin in and out, and that should allow us to constantly adjust the gears as and when we need to without that seizing into the bike. A little bit of our premium grease there on the return spring. Shimano actually greased that spring from the factory, so I always think it's good to set that one up the same as they do. And then a little bit of general purpose oil on the pivots of the derailleur. It's the same principle here on the front derailleur. Premium grease on that spring, and at this generation of Tiagra those springs aren't stainless steel, so they can rust, so we want to make sure they don't. And then on the pivot points here, a little bit of general purpose oil, and that now is ready to be refitted on the bike. Often forgotten are skewers. I see all manner of these. Some have stainless steel shafts, others like this have a flat metal shaft here that I've just put a general purpose oil along, and then I'm using some anti-seize grease on the threads. I often see these where they're bound into a wheel, corroded into the wheel itself, or the arm itself you can't undo because it's seized and corroded. So that's why I always lubricate these skewers before they go back in the wheels. Now I'm going to clean down the frame of the bike, so I'm just using a little bit of a snow foam in a spray here, and then I wash that down with our Big Softy nylon brush, again available on our website. We are in a shop, we have a workshop, and obviously we have no outside facilities to wash bikes down, and I actually don't like getting bikes too wet anyway, so this is a low water style of wash. I can then mop the floor underneath this and keep everything in the shop clean, tidy and safe, and that's why we tend not to use hoses and wash bikes down fully. But you can see this works well, and we're cleaning this bike up really nicely. And then to dry that off, I'm using a microfiber towel. Sometimes I'll use the airline just to blow out little fittings and to really dry the bike down before I get to the stage of rebuilding it. That's now sorted out, and now I'm going to sand down and service the disc. So I use around an 80 grit sandpaper to remove the greases and contaminants off the rotor. These score a little bit like an old-fashioned record where you get little lines around them, and they can cause some of that singing sound that you get when brakes squeal. So I want to make sure that my disc rotors are nice and clean going back on the bike. I'll also measure these for thickness. I actually give a service sheet with all my servicing. I'll write those thicknesses down. There was plenty of meat left on these ones though. And then I give it a final wipe over with brake cleaner, and then I'm going to wash the wheel down. Not only am I washing the wheel down, which is nice for the customer, but I'm also checking the wheel. So I check the spokes, check the rim itself, make sure there's no cracks or damage in there, and also notice things around the tyre. So in the instance of this tyre, these are directional tyres and they're actually fitted the wrong way around, and it was at this point that I noticed it, so we need to deal with that as we go. You can see here how the hub has cleaned up really nicely with that wash down. I'm just using a little bit of general purpose grease on there to help this cassette slide on and also slide off next time. On goes that lock ring there. You saw how I had to use a breaker bar to undo that one, but we're going to torque that up. The torque setting is actually set on these, it's actually written on the center. And then also check the bolts for the disc rotor. It's a lot easier to do it when the wheel is off the bike than on. Next up, I'm going to turn this tyre around, but I also want to put that Pirelli logo there at the top over the valve. I like to have the manufacturer's details over the valve rather than the tyre details. So literally flip that through 180. It's now rotating in the correct direction, and I've got that Pirelli logo over the valve. Rather strangely with this bike, so too was the front wheel on the wrong way round and 180 degrees out. So we set both the tyres correctly. That will help water disperse off them. If you go through a wet piece of road, it will just help the water disperse away from the tyre rather than drawing that water into the centre of the tyre. Inflated that, and then I can also now clean up the pads for the disc brakes. So I do those with a wire brush, and you can see there the difference. The original brake uncleaned up is on the left and the fresh one cleaned up is on the right there. Very subtle, but it removes that debris, gives us a nice braking feel, and that's ready to go. The cables on this bike were a little bit problematic. It's always a fiddle when you're doing internal routed cables. You can see here I have a little guide that I thread through the frame, and so that's my first piece of guide, and then I also will do the same with the front derailleur. These all go around a fitting around the bottom bracket. Sometimes you have to do both cables in order to do one, and it was a bit like that with this bike because I had to replace the actual cable guides that run down the down tube of this bike, which I'll show you shortly. The front derailleur was actually seized in the outer. Again, I'll show that shortly, but initially I need to get these old cable guides and cables out of the frame, but also make it easier for me to put the new ones in. So I actually thread through the cable guides. You can see my hand on it there, and then the second one comes through there. They stay in the frame while I deal with the new cables and new outers, and then I can thread the new ones through. So you can see here how I've got some debris inside that tube and how it's kinked rather strangely here where it goes around the bottom bracket. There's a little kink in there. That's because gradually it's clogged up with debris and eventually seized, and it's been pulling itself through there, which has caused that kink to formulate before eventually the derailleur seized up. So I'll remove those cable outers. I'm going to remove the cables here as well from the shifter, and I'm also going to replace the outer that goes through the handlebars here, so that we've got brand new fresh cabling right the way through this bike, which will help me with making it actuate nicely. So I do need to remove the bar tape to do this, but actually I can reuse this bar tape. There's very little wrong with it, so I can just deal with this underneath it before rewrapping that original bar tape onto the bike. So out comes that outer, so we can now focus on putting our fresh cabling in. I'm using our super slick cables here, again available on our store, which, as I mentioned, the link is in the description below. We do kits of this cabling. We also do it with the outers in black and white as well. But these are a nice tightly wound stainless steel cable. They really do give a great shift. I've used them for decades professionally, and they are a very nice cable. So we'll settle those back in their original position here on the handlebar, using a little bit of tape to hold those where they need to be before we can put the bar tape back on. The bar tape kind of marks itself where it originally was, so you can always see how to retape it so that you've got it almost identical to how it was originally. So that's now in, and everything there is spot on. And then you can see here that white tube in there is the new outer that's going inside the frame that these cables feed through inside the frame. So that's new. And then I'm going to just tuck the remainder of the tail of the cable into those guides that I put in the frame, and then I can just feather those through down the frame, and it makes it much easier for me to route that new cabling through. So I've put it through that fitting at the bottom there. You can see by my hand where that fitting that sits in the bottom bracket is, and then use my guides again just to get this final little stage through for that front derailleur, and everything then is now where it needs to be, ready to refit the components. So at this stage I can now begin to refit the components to the bike. So a little bit of our premium grease here on the chain set to help that slide through the bearings. On goes that pedal arm, and then of course very important not to over tighten that preloader, so that we have that nice free pedal stroke that we will now have with this bike in comparison with how it came in. This bike would have been awful to have ridden when it came in with that brake that was binding and then that chain set that was grabbing on that bottom bracket. Would have been a horrible bike to ride this. We've sorted it out. So on goes the front derailleur. That cable is now nice and smooth through its fittings because everything there is brand new, so we can nip that off, and I know that when we've adjusted this we'll have a lovely shift on this front end. We'll actually show you that towards the end of the video as well. Torque that up. Actually torque all this front section together whilst I'm putting it together, because everything moves in a left and right motion. I want that to be correct, so I always torque that up as I go. This rear hanger I've tightened up on the frame. There's just two little bolts there. This is a very flexible Shimano cable end, this one. So most of the cabling has strands holding the outer shape that then has that outer layer of rubber put over it. But with this one it actually has a tube through the center, and it's a nice end that goes on these where the frame goes to the derailleur, so you don't get that kink that this originally had so much with that tubing that I've used. This is the pivot pin that holds the brake pads in place on the caliper. I've used a little bit of anti-seize grease on the threads and then general purpose grease on the shaft. And also on these they have a metal piston, and it can corrode on the back of these pads, so I put a little bit of anti-seize grease. You can see it was a minimalist amount, but it can just stop that corrosion forming between the two layers without being detrimental to the brake in any way. And then that safety clip goes on there as well to make sure that we're going to have no problems should this pin ever come undone. So in goes the second pin in the front, then you'll see again that safety clip, which really makes everything as it should be. In goes the front wheel. That's great, that's fitted nicely. In goes this back wheel. So we've got everything there set up. We do need to adjust that rear brake, which we'll do momentarily. But on goes a brand new chain. Now this is actually a Shimano Tiagra chain that I've replaced this with, so it's the correct one for the group set. And I do find specifically with Shimano that I personally think you should always stick to a Shimano chain on a Shimano group set, because it all works together and works nicely for a smoother shift. These have a pin that goes through the center of them that have this little end on them that you have to snap off. So we've done that this time. If I service this bike again with the same chain, I'll put a quick link in, but initially I use the pin that come in the box with the chain. A little bit of a thumb adjuster work on the rear derailleur, and you can see how smoothly that's changing gear. You can see that cable end now, how smooth that is out of the frame. Front derailleur working perfectly, bearing in mind that wasn't working at all and was seized. And then the back brake that was having that binding issue, I've undone the caliper bolts here. That allows the caliper to go free. Then I'll pull the brake 2 or 3 times. That will center that caliper, and on that final pull I hold it on and then tighten that up, and that will just centralize that brake caliper on that disc rotor. And you can see here we've got a nice free flowing wheel with a good braking actuation, so that is now as it needs to be. Same with the front brake, good braking actuation, everything there working perfectly. And now I'm going to go through the bike with a torque wrench. The brakes are loose on those handlebars. You don't want these loose in the event of an accident. That's what you're hanging on to, so it's good to get these secure. These crown bolts, you can see here I get about 1/4 of a turn to 1/2 a turn on these. So there's always issues I can find by going through a bike with a torque wrench. We've already had things like the rear cassette that were too tight, and now we've got things like that that are too loose. I noticed here the last spacer was just stepped off. It was just stepped to one side of the cap. That normally is a reason that the steerer tube isn't long enough for that cap to be sitting, which means chances are it's not needed. And you can see here it floats about very, very loosely on that steerer tube, so it's actually not needed. So I removed that and gave that back to the customer, and then he can fit that if he needs to in the future, space it in any way differently, but it wasn't needed for the length of the steerer tube that we had. The seat post is very loose. Now chances are this customer had actually adjusted this to make sure the bike suited him, but we've checked that and make sure that seat post isn't going to drop into the frame. But also the saddle is loose. Very common for these to rattle loose over a distance, so check that. And then obviously we've had some of these components off, so we'll talk the components that we've removed as well. So that's the rear derailleur there, and then I've obviously already tightened up the front when we put it on. And then the final thing for me to do is to check the brakes. This is the front brake, which we haven't took off, but we do need to check it. And also the pinch bolt for the cables. That's now all the work completed on this bike. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Here's a few before and afters of the bike we've serviced. It comes up amazing with a good clean and a good lubrication, and everything on this bike is working now as it needs to. Please do like this video if you've enjoyed it. If you're watching this on the TV, the button is down and across. That really helps us out massively, so thank you for that. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.